In this video, I'm going to talk about the Tsitsit command. I'm going to be discussing this from the interpretation of Tsitsit being tassels, because that is what I see the evidence pointing to. But that will need to be a topic for a different video. Instead, I'm going to focus on the colored thread that is being included in the Tsitsit, the tassel, being the Tekeleth. I'm going to discuss the evidence that I came across, some different views on the subject, my reasoning, and the practical aspects that result. There is somewhat of a complication in looking at this issue because language very strongly affects our interpretation of color. While on the one hand, the human body has the ability to discern a vast number of colors, an underappreciated fact is that our language, which is directly related to our culture, has a strong influence on what we draw attention to in the world, how we categorize the things we sense, and how we interpret that information as a result. This goes beyond just the abstract concepts, and even things like differences in color may be seen from a different point of view, and we may group together colors in different ways because we are drawing attention to different aspects of them. For example, there's a word in Psalm 68, 13 or 14, which appears to be used for both green and yellow at different times. So just like with anything else, the word in question may not be as simple as being a specific primary or secondary color in the way we might think of it, or the word may not actually refer to just a color, as I will get into. As we know, the thread in Numbers 15:38 is commonly interpreted as being some sort of blue, though sometimes it is thought to be purple. Getting into some specific views, one rabbinic tradition is that it's supposed to be similar to the color of the sky, but beyond that statement alone, minimal justification is given. From that specific angle, all that I saw was the statement that the throne of Elohim is the sky, therefore that should be the color in question. To me, that statement is vague and could refer to a number of different colors, and in my view, the statement about the throne is not actually evidence or reasoning at all. It would be one thing if there was some kind of explicit reference to that in the text of the command itself, but there is no clear indication of that. To me, the throne aspect just seems to be an arbitrary justification for that view. It's the same type of rationalization that could be created to support any view on any subject, and even if these rationalizations can make sense on some level, if there's nothing substantial that backs it up, then there's nothing that can set it apart from any other claim of its type other than just personal feelings. I remember back when I was first seeking to observe this command that someone gave me a similar type of claim while asserting the color was supposed to be royal blue. Instead of using evidence, the assertion was that the people of Israel are royalty, therefore the color is supposed to represent that. Whether or not I agree with the actual practical conclusion of that, it's clearly the same type of rationalizing as the idea of the sky being the throne, and as a result, I don't regard that statement as actual evidence either. In general, when looking to interpret commands, I don't view these claims of metaphors or symbols as bearing any relevance because when we're just working on that level, anyone can come up with anything that someone will think sounds good. One bit of information that may be of slight interest, although with its own problems, is the early Greek translation of the word. The Greek word could be read as referring to hyacinthine. Not always, but generally speaking, that appears to refer to a blue-purple range. However, the Greek translation is notoriously unreliable. On the one hand, while one would assume it should have some value, on the other hand, there are cases when we know the Greek is misleadingly translated or otherwise totally incorrectly translated, so its value as evidence is low. Another view that I came across in my research was the idea that the colored thread is purple, or maybe I should say some type of purple. There does appear to be a sort of scholarly consensus on this view, but I think there is more nuance involved than just interpreting it as purple. One thing I noticed in researching this both in Hebrew and in related Semitic languages is that the word typically appears in a list of materials alongside another word, which is typically understood as purple. which is argamon. Since these two words appear to be distinct, and since they're being used in parallel to make garments for the priesthood and components for the tent of meeting, but are two separate materials, there must be some difference between the two. What I found for argamon pointed to it being a type of red purple, or more specifically, a material dyed in that color range. So as far as Tekeleth is concerned, it would seem to indicate that the color we are concerned with is probably different from red purple. The most compelling bit of evidence that I came across for the color of the Tekeleth was an Akkadian reference. This reference compared the color of Tekeleth, or Tekeleth, to the color of lapis lazuli. Lapis lazuli, as I would understand it, appears to be a range from a bright blue to a bluish purple. To me, this seems to be the best evidence for an actual color that I came across, and I don't see anything of substance that appears to contradict this. To me, it seems pretty likely that the color in question for the thread included in the tassel is some type of range of blue to purple. So personally, I would see blue, deep blue, blue to blue purple as being possibilities for that color. However, there may actually be more to it than just defining what color the word refers to. One thing that I wondered about whenever I started looking into this was what exactly this word is referring to. Is the word referring to a color, or is it a word for a dye, or is it a word for a material? You can check out how this is used throughout the Torah and the latter parts of the Tanakh, and I invite you to look into that on your own time in your own reading. But I will say that it appears to me, based on context clues alone, that the word refers to a material. That appears to be the best fit across the different contexts. There are some references in the latter parts of the Tanakh that appear to support this more clearly, and one could also look at how it is used in reference to the tent of meeting and the priestly garments for the tent of meeting, and see that this interpretation would fit. One thing I came across in my research of the color the word is referring to was a near universal acceptance that is referring to a color of dyed wool. This seems to be consistently supported by how it is used in related languages and is supported by the aforementioned lapis lazuli reference, which actually refers to it as being lapis lazuli colored wool. It is also used in lists of different colors of wool. It's indicated to be a part of that category of goods. And it is described as being made by taking wool and dyeing it with a dye in boiling water. And this understanding of it being wool appears to be supported by Jewish traditions on this subject. I'll also add that the aforementioned argamon for red-purple, which often appears in parallel with Tekeleth, is also clearly a type of dyed wool based on the evidence I've seen for it. So to clarify, I'm not saying that the Hebrew word for wool is used in Numbers 15:38. What I am saying is that the word, which is often translated as blue, appears to have that meaning built into it. It's not just a word for a color or dye, it appears to be a word for a specific material. Rather than just meaning blue, it appears to mean blue wool or blue-purple wool or lapis lazuli colored wool. That's backed up both by the apparent linguistic evidence and the traditional evidence. Of course, this brings up a question regarding the commands of Leviticus 19:19 and Deuteronomy 22:11. Wouldn't this be creating adulterated fiber? Wouldn't the interpretation of blue-purple wool be potentially in violation of these commands in the case that the base garment is not wool? I have a few thoughts on this. One thing I came across in my research was Exodus 28:31-33. It says that the robe of the ephod is made entirely of Tekeleth. Note the wording here, entirely. But a few verses later, it describes the ornamentation being made on the skirts of this garment, and it uses other materials apart from Tekeleth alone. I found this somewhat interesting because it says the article is made fully from the one material, and yet it has other materials added onto it in ornamentation similar to tassels. That being said, I recognize that this is not decisive and it may not actually be meaningful in any way. and it may just be an artifact of the wording, which is not actually significant in that way. But I thought I'd mention it for your consideration. More importantly, in my view, there are a number of commands in the law which tell us to do a certain thing or to never do a certain thing, and yet there are exceptions which are provided or implied. For example, in reference to the anointing oil of the tent of meeting. Exodus 30:32 says that it is not supposed to be applied on the flesh of a human. Right after, it is described as being used on Aharon and his sons. Even more clearly, there are verses such as Leviticus 24:17, which explicitly say a person deserves the death penalty for killing any human being. And the word being used does not refer to murder alone, which, as an aside, I intend to discuss that later in another video. But despite that command regarding killing any human being, we have laws about capital punishment, we have the avenger of blood, and we have warfare and other situations which are apparently allowed and do not involve that punishment, despite it saying any. So personally, I hesitate to assume that this apparent contradiction is not intended or that that would render the evidence to be not relevant. It is true that there could have been a shift in the meaning of the word as it was borrowed into Hebrew, and I have seen a single claim that suggests it may refer to blue-purple material not being isolated to wool, but I didn't see anything backing that up. Any evidence of that supposed shift of meaning does not appear to be there from what I see. In my view, the evidence is undeniable that the word in question, when used in the cognate languages, refers to wool. And this is backed up by Jewish tradition, which by itself may not be necessarily proof, but the fact that it coincides with the other evidence is rather conspicuous. Just in terms of how the word appears to be used in the Hebrew, I don't see a reason to think otherwise. Also, I will mention that I have heard in the past that there was this understanding by the Orthodox that the Tsitsit and some of the priest's garments are made using linen and wool, and that they are somehow excluded from the commands regarding that because they are supposedly uniquely holy. In the past, I viewed that idea regarding the Tsitsit, at least, being uniquely holy as unreasonable and just dismissed it, but I can somewhat understand where they're coming from with that. Personally, I think the argument about inherent holiness is weak, because Tsitsit is not referred to as being inherently holy, although Numbers 15:40 does go on to say that as a result of it, that we are to be holy ones to Elohim, which might be seen as interesting. That being said, I think we should be very cautious about that type of thinking regarding commands if the text of the command doesn't outright explain this reasoning. And I think we should ultimately just reject those types of arguments on their face, because anyone can come up with a reason behind any interpretation for a command, and someone out there will think that it sounds believable, whether there's any basis or not. So while I'm not fond of that type of explanation, the fact that the actual practical conclusion of that coincides with the evidence that I've seen does seem worth acknowledging. So I recognize that this interpretation will be controversial, and I wouldn't blame someone if they were unsure about it, but I do think we should acknowledge the evidence and consider it. As a bit of an aside, for the sake of completeness, I thought I'd mention one other reference that I came across. In my research, I more or less dismissed this bit, which I'm about to share, after I checked into it, but I thought I would include it anyway. In my Akkadian research, I was looking into one of the words used for wool aside from the words which I've already mentioned. I found one obscure reference that used a word for wool as referring to some other fiber that wasn't wool. The reference mentioned that they were trying to cultivate a wool-bearing tree. One speculation was that this was probably referring to the Indian cotton tree, and they speculated, since this was not mentioned further, that the cultivation must have failed or not continued. This reference appeared to be isolated and did not appear to be the normal use of that word. I did not see any hint of that sort of use anywhere else. I did not see any such thing connected with the relevant words mentioned before. Personally, I don't think that this bears any relevance or significance to the issue at hand, and personally I hesitated to even bring it up because I was concerned that someone might infer that wool in terms of Akkadian must be some generic word for textile material in general, even without really delving into the research and even without acknowledging that this is just a single reference. But on the other hand, my purpose in this is sharing my research and sharing the likely indications and possibilities of that research. So I decided to include this bit anyway. Once again, the reference to the wool-bearing tree has no direct association or connection with the word for Tekeleth, but there it is. Now that we've considered the color and now that we've considered the material issue, one final aspect of the word Tekeleth that I want to discuss is the nature of the dye. One prominent view is the material needs to be dyed with a dye of a specific origin and manufacture, rather than just being a material dyed in a color range. The general consensus of those with that view is that the dye comes from a type of sea snail. Obviously, a possible objection to this is the fact that such an animal would be unclean. One thing I think is interesting is that Leviticus 11 does not say that you cannot touch the carcass of an unclean aquatic creature, unlike with the carcass of unclean beasts, which we are forbidden from touching. However, it does say we are to treat them as repulsive, or at least consider them ritually segregated from clean animals. And they do apparently cause a person to become unclean. Some might assume by extension that the tent of meeting and the garments of the priests and so forth being holy could not include something which is a byproduct of an unclean animal. Personally, I think we should be slow to assume something like that which is not explicitly stated, especially when there appears to be more evidence which would contradict that assumption, which I intend to address that in future videos. As far as this specific issue is concerned, I'm not saying I necessarily agree or disagree regarding the sea snail view, but I am just offering some different angles to the subject. Some might say that maybe the Israelites were not the ones actually making the dye or the resulting fabric. Some have suggested that maybe the manufacturers didn't actually kill the snail. Maybe they just agitated it in order to get the relevant secretions to make the dye. Therefore, they wouldn't necessarily be dealing with the carcass of the animal. But I've also read that this method of milking them is probably unrealistic and would require a huge number of these animals and just a massive labor-intensive operation just to produce a small amount of dye. From my understanding, even though it does seem to be accepted that dyes were manufactured in the area using sea snails, there seems to be little information about what was involved or how it was done, and it may effectively have been a trade secret of sorts. I am aware that there are some groups today which are specifically looking into that very subject, and that may be of interest. Something I came across in my reading that would relate to that is the Akkadian passage that I referred to earlier about how Tekeleth was made. From my understanding, it talked about processing wool into Tekeleth using boiling water and a type of dye. I attempted to briefly look into the word used for the dye in that passage, but I didn't find anything decisive. I did come across a word that was similar to that word, and it also clearly referred to a dye, at least in some cases, and based upon how that word was used, it appeared to be connected with a plant. That being said, it was uncertain as to whether that word was actually relevant and whether it was actually connected to the other word in question. One thing that may be a contraindication was the understanding that the dye was a green or yellow dye, aside from the fact that it may not have actually been the exact same word. Either way, that may be worth exploring at some point. One other angle on whether Tekeleth refers to a specific dye Some might suggest that the dye is not the important part, but the resulting color range of the dyed material is what matters. I personally am not sure, but in support of that, one might argue that the Akkadian reference to lapis lazuli is to lapis lazuli rather than to a sea snail or something else. The material is not obviously referred to as snail-dyed wool or something like that. It appears to be referring to the resulting color. That being said, I wouldn't consider that alone to be decisive, and it's still possible that a specific origin for the dye was understood by the language regardless. For me, I'm not sure, but practically speaking, I've been treating it as a color range rather than a specific dye, at least at this point in time. So that is most of the information I wanted to share regarding the word in question. I wanted to finish up with a bit of practical discussion about this, because I believe that researching these subjects is not about the mental exercise, but it's about learning for the sake of applying it and doing it. As some of you know, I don't believe in the idea of having some special rectangular garment that has tassels on it to the exclusion of all others. Also, I don't practice having just a set of tassels that I move around to belt loops or use with safety pins or anything like that. What I do is make tassels onto my clothes, and I believe this is clearly suggested by Numbers 15:38. Simply put, I take a large sewing needle, I use that to pass multiple lengths of thread or floss or yarn through the fabric, and then I knot that into tassels. I do that at 4 different places on the extremities or the flaps of the garment. I view this as supported by the text and the language, and while I know some people think that it's not actually supposed to be tassels, this is my view based upon the research. So I've already had tassels on the clothes that I wear before coming to this understanding about the word, so what I have done is either just completely redo them or sew in a length of blue or blue-purple wool thread or floss or yarn into the existing tassels. Something I realized very quickly is that working with this material makes it much more complicated than just with cotton or other fibers. After I acquired 2 different kinds of 100% wool thread or floss, I quickly realized that it's not very strong and it's susceptible to breaking. While this may be partially because of the kinds which I purchased, both of them exhibit this same problem on some level. One thing that would happen is that I would send the clothes through the washer and dryer, and while an entirely cotton tassel would have been fine, with the use of the wool, sometimes immediately or sometimes after a few cycles, all that would be left would just be a little shred of the wool extending below the knot. Some have suggested that maybe an enzymatic detergent is part of the problem, but even using a natural soap, the wear from the washer and the dryer are still an issue which is not present in the same way as it is with the other materials. And some say that maybe hand washing or line drying would fix that issue. I don't know. The solution that I found was to change the way I was making the tassels in order to protect the thread. I started making a braided tassel, which is similar to one Karaite view on the subject of the tassel itself. I found the knots helped to preserve the thread and not leave it as susceptible to damage. This is certainly much more effort, but it seems to work a lot better than what I was doing before. So from a practical point of view, that seems to be the way to go, at least with what I have been working with. So that wraps up all I wanted to talk about for now with regard to the Tsitsit and the Tekeleth. Feel free to check into this and to consider the issues and to consider the evidence, and feel free to act and do the command accordingly. To me, there are a lot of things in the world that we simply don't have 100% knowledge of. And with regard to many of those things, of course, we can use that as a prompt to gain more knowledge, to investigate an issue or things like that. But at a point, it may come to where we decide we're not really sure what else to look at, we're not really sure how to gain more knowledge, and we can either just decide that, like with regard to this issue, like some people out there have decided that we don't know, therefore we're not going to even try to do it. In my view, in cases like this, the best course of action tends to be look at what we know, assess using our best wisdom, our best seeking of Elohim, etc., and then act upon that.